Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into, well, it feels like a constant high-stakes battle. The ever-evolving world of modern hacking tactics.
Yeah.
It's basically a digital battlefield out there, and the adversaries, they're getting incredibly sophisticated, constantly shifting their strategies.
That's absolutely right. And our mission, with this deep dive is really to cut through all the noise. We want to reveal how these really intricate attacks were pulled off,
Yeah.
highlight the implications, what it means for everyone, and crucially, uncover the vulnerabilities they exploited. It's not just a history lesson, right? It's about what you can actually learn from this.
Exactly. What can you take away to, beef up your own defenses? We've gone through a whole stack of sources, articles, research papers, our own notes, the works. Try to give you that shortcut to being really well informed on these pretty complex topics. Think of it like a playbook, maybe. Understanding the modern threat landscape.
Yeah, playbook is a good way to put it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where should we start? I think the really insidious stuff is the supply chain compromises. It's like hackers are finding these new places to hide right in the channels we're supposed to trust.
It's incredibly clever, actually, and worrying. The supply chain is such a prime target because of that trust.
Yeah.
Organizations they often assume updates, third-party components, they assume they're secure.
Oh, you just click update.
Exactly. It's the ultimate sort of trust but verify situation, only the attackers are exploiting the trust part really cunningly.
And the big one, the poster child for this has got to be SolarWinds. Back in 2020, this was nation-state level stuff. They Trojanized a core library in the Orion network monitoring software. Could you walk us through how they actually did that?
Right, SolarWinds. So they embedded this backdoor called Sunburst, and it went right into a really critical file in the Orion software, solarwinds.orion.core.businesslayer.dll.
Okay.
And the sneaky part, it was delivered through totally normal routine software updates. People thought they were just patching. The stealth involved was really remarkable. There was like a 2-week delay before it even did anything. Then this memory-only dropper, they called it, teardrop, would kick in and unleash cobalt strike beacons.
Wait, hang on. Memory-only dropper. So that means, what, it barely left a trace on the actual disk?
Yeah.
Making it super hard to find?
Precisely. It executes directly in memory, which makes forensic analysis much, much harder. And here's the really chilling part, the thing that made it so effective.
Yeah.
The Trojanized DLL, the malicious file, it was signed with stolen SolarWinds certificates.
Oh, wow. So it looked completely legitimate, signed by the vendor themselves.
Exactly. It wasn't just a hack. It was this act of profound deception using SolarWinds' own digital signature against its customers. Think about ATT&CK techniques like obfuscation and code signing evasion. T1553.002, T1036. It's classic advanced evasion.
That is next-level deception.
Yeah.
So what was the actual damage, the impact of that? And what's the core lesson for us?
The impact was just colossal. Tens of thousands of networks, including major government agencies and corporations, were exposed. They had these stealthy command control channels opened up, ripe for credential theft and further attacks.
Right.
The profound insight here, I think, is that trust in your most critical software updates, something we maybe took for granted, is now a primary attack vector.
Yeah.
It fundamentally changes how you have to think about supply chain security.
So it's not just about what comes in, but who's signed
Right.
it, and can you even trust the signature?
Precisely. For your security architecture, you absolutely need to be verifying update hashes. You need to think about isolating these supply chain tools, maybe in segmented networks, and implementing really rigorous code signing checks and patch validation processes.
Yep.
This hits multiple CISSP domains, right? Software development security, security operations, communication security. It's all connected.
Okay, so SolarWinds was huge. But then a slightly different playbook, but similar theme, unfolded with the Kaseya VSA attack in July 2021. This was the Revil ransomware group. They didn't directly breach Kaseya's servers, did they?
Yeah.
They went after the internet-facing Kaseya VSA instances. How did that work?
Right, Kaseya was different. They likely found an authentication bypass vulnerability, something letting them get into these VSA management servers without needing proper credentials.
Okay.
And from there, they distributed a malicious hotfix to thousands of networks managed by those VSA servers. It was a supply chain attack, but leveraging the management tool itself.
So they poisoned the management tool to hit all its clients.
Exactly. And this hotfix was, it was a masterclass innovation. It created a hidden directory, C working, dropped a certificate file, agent.crt, and a payload, agent.exe, then ran a PowerShell script with system rights.
System rights. Okay, that's game over territory.
Pretty much. And crucially, that script actively disarmed Windows Defender, disabled real-time scanning, HIPS, the works. They even used built-in Windows tools like Certil to decode the payload and launch the ransomware, living off the land again.
Wow, turning the system's own tools against it. That's bold.
It absolutely was. But the really critical move, the sort of checkmate moment, they Trojanized a core Windows service. They actually replaced the legitimate Defender engine, msmpem.exe, with an older, vulnerable version.
Replace the Defender engine itself. How does that help them?
Because that older version had a known vulnerability that allowed for DLL sideloading.
Sideloading, can you break that down quickly?
Sure. Sideloading is basically tricking a legitimate, trusted program into loading a malicious DLL file instead of the one it's supposed to load. Because the program itself is trusted, the malicious code it loads might bypass some security checks. In this case, the older Defender engine loaded Revel's encryptor DLL, and crucially, it did so with system privileges.
Got it. So they used the Trusted Defender process to run their ransomware with the highest permissions. That's deeply concerning.
It is. The big takeaway from Kaseya, I think, is that even your routine patch cycles, even your core security services can be poisoned. It just hammers home the need for defense in depth. T1195.002 and migrity and the principle of least privilege. Why does a management agent need system everywhere?
So mitigations. What can you do against that?
Segmenting those management networks is huge. If one MSP using Kaseya gets hit, it shouldn't cascade to all their clients' internal networks. And diligently verifying the integrity of update processes, all update processes, even for your security tools. Trust nothing implicitly.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about exploiting trust in the supply chain. What about just finding flaws, unpatched holes in software everyone uses? When those get exploited, the impact is, well, immediate and global. It feels like a constant race, doesn't it?
It truly is. It's this relentless race between researchers finding vulnerabilities, vendors patching them, and attackers weaponizing them. Every minute counts once a zero-day drops.
And a massive example of this was the Exchange ProxyLogon mess in March 2021. This wasn't just one bug. It was a chain of 4 0 days in on-premises Exchange.
Right.
The Hafnium APT group used these to bypass authentication, run code, drop web shells, basically full server takeover.
Yeah.
How did they string those 4 bugs together?
It was quite elegant in a scary way. First, they used a server-side request forgery bug. That's the SSRF CVE 26855. This let them essentially trick the server into acting like an admin even without credentials.
Okay, so they impersonated an admin.
Exactly. Then they combine that with a deserialization flaw, CVE 26857. Deserialization bugs are tricky, but basically they let an attacker sneak malicious code into data the server's processing, and then the server executes it. This got them system privileges.
Right, and with system.
They could do pretty much anything.
Right.
Specifically, they used 2 more vulnerabilities, CVE 26858 and 27065, which allowed them to write files after authentication, which they now had thanks to the first bugs. They used this to drop malicious ASPX web shells onto the server.
So web shells give them persistent remote control.
Precisely. Once those shells were in place, they could come back anytime, and they did. They used standard tools, things like procdump, to dump the LSAS process memory. That's where Windows stores credentials. They zipped up mailbox data using 7-zip. Siphoned the offline address book, standard post-exploitation stuff, but enabled by those chained 0 days.
That's a devastating chain reaction. What's the big lesson here for the defenders, for our listeners?
Well, first, it shows how attackers chain multiple, seemingly unrelated vulnerabilities, exploiting public-facing applications. T1190 is just the start. Second, it highlighted the risk of those often forgotten or maybe undermanaged on-prem servers. A lot of these Exchange servers didn't have MFA, or they used service accounts with way too many privileges.
Which relates to identity and access management, right? CISSP domain 5.
Absolutely. Proper IAM could have potentially stopped or slowed them down. And from an incident response perspective, we saw the mad scramble for emergency patches and scanning scripts. Defensively, it screams defense in depth. Domain 4 stuff, like putting those servers in a DMZ, using a WAF to filter requests, blocking direct internet access if possible, and obviously rigorous routine patching. Vulnerability management, domain 6. It's fundamental.
Okay, so ProxyLogon was bad, but then just a few months later, December 2021, the internet basically caught fire with Apache Log4j Log4 shell.
Oh, yeah.
This tiny bug in a Java logging library turned into this global crisis overnight. It felt like every security team on the planet was scrambling.
It was. It was genuinely alarming. Probably one of the most serious vulnerabilities we've seen in, well, maybe a decade, because Log4j is everywhere.
So how did the exploit actually work? It seemed almost too simple.
It was terrifyingly simple. An attacker could just send a specially crafted string in data that would get logged by an application using a vulnerable Log4j version, something like jndi.al.evil.com. When Log4j processed that string, the JNDI part, Java Naming and Directory Interface, would trigger a lookup. It would actually reach out to the attacker's server, evil.com in the example, via LDAP or DNS or other protocols. Download a malicious Java class and execute it.
So wait, just logging a specific message could make the server download and run code from some random place on the internet with no authentication.
Exactly. Unauthenticated remote code execution, RCE. On potentially hundreds, thousands of different products and services that use this library, often buried deep inside. It was bad. MITRE ATT&CK T1190, exploit public-facing application, again, but on a massive scale.
And the impact was immediate, right?
Oh, instantaneous. Within hours, maybe even minutes of the proof-of-concept code hitting the public, servers worldwide were getting scanned and exploited. We saw mass deployment of crypto miners, remote access Trojans, RATs, data exfiltration tools, and CISA reported sophisticated groups, APTs, continued exploiting it for months, long after the initial frenzy.
So what's the core insight from Log4Shell? It seems like it's about dependencies.
Absolutely. It's the hidden risk of these ubiquitous, deeply embedded open source libraries. You might not even know you're running Log4j or which version. It could be a dependency of something you bought.
Which ties right into DevSecOps, Domain 8 stuff,
Yeah.
like vetting your third-party libraries, software composition analysis.
Exactly that. And it also just hammers home the critical need for accurate asset inventory. You simply cannot defend against something like Log4Shell if you don't know where Log4j is running in your environment. You need that visibility first.
Makes sense. So immediate actions for something this big. What did organizations have to do?
Well, first, patch. Update Log4j to version 2.4 or later immediately. But patching wasn't always easy or fast. So second, blocking those malicious JNDI callbacks at the network edge using firewalls or WFs. And third, having good endpoint detection and response, EDR and WF signatures specifically looking for Log4Shell exploitation attempts.
Got it. Okay, one more in this vein before we move on. June 2022, Atlassian Confluence Server, another RCE.
Right, CVE 2022-26134. This was an unauthenticated RCE again, this time via something called OGNL injection, Object Graph Navigation Language.
OGNL injection.
Yeah.
Similar idea to the Log4j JNDI thing, input that gets executed.
Sort of, yeah. It allowed an attacker to send a crafted request to a Confluence server and basically run arbitrary code, bypassing login completely. And there were like over 19,000 vulnerable instances identified pretty quickly on the internet.
Wow, and what did attackers do once they got in?
Immediate exploitation. Again, we saw cryptocurrency miners being dropped almost instantly. Then came ransomware crews like Cerber. We saw forensic traces where the Confluence Tomcat.exe process itself was spawning reconnaissance commands like WAMI or epconfig, then executing base64 encoded PowerShell scripts to download further payloads from the internet.
So a direct path from that initial web exploit straight to running recon and dropping ransomware.
Exactly. Direct initial access via the vulnerability, followed by in-memory PowerShell launches, classic TTPs.
And the defense here, similar story.
Pretty much. Fast patch management is number one. Patching CVE 2022-2611 Thurfew was critical. Then strong network perimeter controls, WAFs again, and intrusion detection, looking specifically for those unusual web POS2 requests that trigger the OGNL injection, or watching for unexpected PowerShell launches coming from your Confluence server process. Domain 4, Domain 6 stuff.
Okay, let's pivot slightly. We've talked supply chains, we've talked 0 days. What about tools specifically designed for moving data? Managed file transfer or MFT solutions. These seem like prime targets too, holding potentially vast amounts of sensitive information.
You've hit on a really crucial point there. The very purpose of these MFT systems is to handle large, often sensitive data transfer. So yeah, they become these incredibly valuable centralized repositories. Compromise one, and you potentially have access to a goldmine of data.
And the huge one recently was the MOVEit transfer breach in 2023. This involved the CL0P ransomware operators.
That's right. CL0P exploited a 0-day SQL injection vulnerability, CVE 2023-34362.
SQL injection, so manipulating database queries through the web interface.
Exactly. They crafted a specific web request to MOVEit's interface that exploited this SQL flaw. And they used it not just to steal data directly, but initially to plant a web shell.
A web shell again. What did this one do?
This one was called Lemur Loot. It was initially dropped onto the server, disguised as a legitimate file, human2.spx. Clever naming.
Sneaky.
Very. And its functionality was, well, pretty extensive. It listened for a specific custom HTTP header X-Silot comment, basically using that header value as a password to activate itself.
Okay, so password protected backdoor.
Right. Once activated, it could enumerate the entire backend SQL database, listing folders, files, users. It could download any file stored in MOVEit, and it could even create new administrative accounts within MOVEit, giving the attackers persistent privileged access.
Wow. So that single SQL injection basically gave them the keys to the kingdom, total visibility, total control over the data.
Pretty much, yeah. The web shell was sophisticated enough to import MOVEit's own internal libraries to interact with the system properly, query folder structures, user details, even Azure Blob storage settings if cloud storage was used. They could just hoover up everything.
So what's the core insight from MOVEit, besides patch immediately, which CISA definitely flagged?
Well, beyond patching, it really underscores how a relatively common vulnerability type like SQL injection, if present in a critical data-rich application, can lead to catastrophic data loss. It brings us back to protecting data at rest, domain 2 in CISSP terms.
Oh, so?
Well, think about database privileges. Maybe the web application's database user didn't need permissions to, say, create new admin accounts or perform certain system-level queries. Implementing least privilege at the database level could have potentially limited the impact of the initial SQL exploit. It might have gotten some data, but maybe not full control or the ability to create new admins.
Right, limiting the blast radius even if the initial entry happens.
Exactly, and it also reinforces the need for things like web application firewalls that might be able to detect and block common SQL injection patterns, even against 0 days sometimes.
This pattern, exploiting file transfer systems, it sounds familiar. Didn't something similar happen with Italian FTA a couple of years before MOVEit?
It did, yes. Late 2020, early 2021. Very similar pattern. Excellion file transfer appliance, often outdated versions, hit by vulnerabilities, primarily SQL injection again. Attackers got in, planted web shells, and exfiltrated large archives of sensitive data from major organizations.
So MOVEit and Excellion together really drive home a point.
Absolutely. They hammer home that principle of defense in depth for these critical data handling applications. You need multiple layers. Secure coding practices to prevent the SQL in the first place, regular patching, WAF in front, maybe network segmentation separating the MFT server, and certainly least privilege principles apply to the application and its database access. You can't rely on just one thing.
Okay, now let's talk about the attack type that probably gets the most headlines. The one that feels like the most direct, crippling blow: ransomware. Especially when it hits critical infrastructure. This isn't just an IT problem anymore, is it? We're talking about potentially shutting down pipelines, stopping food production, disrupting hospitals. It's a societal issue.
You're absolutely right. Ransomware has fundamentally shifted. It's gone from being, an annoying IT security headache to a full-blown business continuity crisis, sometimes even a national security issue. The potential impact goes way beyond just encrypted files. It can halt physical operations, endanger public safety, and have huge economic consequences.
And the perfect terrifying example has to be the Colonial Pipeline attack in May 2021.
Oh, definitely.
The DarkSide ransomware group got in.
Oh.
They used a stolen VPN credential. And here's the kicker, right? The really crucial detail.
No MFA.
Exactly. That VPN account had no multi-factor authentication. So the attackers got a password, probably from a previous breach or phishing, and that single password was literally all they needed to walk right into the network.
It's staggering, isn't it? Once they were inside Colonial's IT network with that VPN access, DarkSide moved laterally, explored the network, exfiltrated about 100 gigabytes of data, the double extortion tactic, and then detonated the ransomware encrypting systems across the IT network.
And the impact was immediate and huge. They shut down the pipeline.
Right. Crucially, they shut down the operational technology OT side, the pipeline itself, largely out of an abundance of caution. They weren't sure if the ransomware had spread or could spread from the IT network to the OT network that controlled the pipeline operations. So they proactively shut it down to prevent a potentially catastrophic physical incident.
Which caused massive fuel shortages on the U.S. East Coast.
Exactly. And they ended up paying the ransom, around $4.4 million in Bitcoin, though the FBI later recovered a significant chunk of it.
So what are the key takeaways from Colonial? It seems almost too simple in some ways.
It highlights fundamental security failures, honestly. Exploitation of stolen credentials, TA0001, valid accounts. That's basic blocking and tackling. The core lesson is profound. A single point of failure in this case, that compromised credential without MFA, can bring down a critical national infrastructure operation.
So defense in depth is the key mitigation.
Absolutely. Enforce MFA everywhere, especially for remote access. That's Domain 5, Identity and Access Management 101. Segment your networks properly. An IT breach should not be able to easily spill over and impact critical OT systems. That separation is vital. And of course, have up-to-date tested offline backups. That's Domain 7, Security Ops, and Disaster Recovery. You need to be able to recover without paying. Colonial also highlighted the importance of having and practicing your incident response plan.
Right. Don't wait for the crisis to figure out who to call.
Precisely. And we saw a very similar playbook, disturbingly similar, just weeks later with the JBS meatpacking attack, also May 2021.
That was Rivel again, wasn't it?
Yes, Revil this time, but the pattern was mirrored. Initial access likely via compromised credentials, lateral movement, data exfiltration, and then widespread encryption hitting their meat processing plants globally. They also paid a significant ransom, about $11 million.
So JBS and Colonial back to back. What does that tell us about managing risk in these critical sectors?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, CISSP Domain 1, security and risk management, these incidents prove you have to treat ransomware as a fundamental business continuity risk, not just a cybersecurity problem handled by the IT department. It requires board-level attention, investment in resilience, and understanding the potential physical and economic impacts.
It's amazing, though. We talk about all this sophisticated malware, 0 days, nation-state actors, but so many breaches still boil down to that human element. Someone clicking a link, someone using a password, someone falling for a social engineering trick. It feels like the password is still often the weakest link.
It's true, isn't it? It's kind of remarkable and maybe a bit depressing for security pros, how often the simplest attack vectors exploiting human trust or fatigue or just oversight remain incredibly effective. Technology can be bypassed, but fooling a person, that often works.
Let's look at the Okta incident from March 2022. The LMPS CSCS group made a lot of noise about breaching Okta. What actually happened there?
Right, LAPSS claimed a big win, but the reality was a bit more nuanced. They didn't breach Okta's core production service. What they did manage to compromise was a workstation belonging to an engineer at a third-party contractor, a company called CITL, that provided customer support services for Okta.
Ah, so another supply chain vector, but this time through a human contractor.
Exactly. An attacker apparently gained access to this CITL engineer's machine, likely via Remote Desktop Protocol, RDP. And crucially, that machine happened to have an active, logged-in Okta support session running.
Oh, okay, so the attacker piggybacked on the legitimate session.
Essentially, yes. They couldn't log in as the engineer to Okta systems directly, but because the session was already active on the compromised machine, they could interact with it. They were able to take screenshots of Okta's internal tools and dashboards that the support engineer had access to.
But did they actually compromise Okta accounts or data directly?
This is the key insight. Okta stated clearly that its MFA controls blocked any attempts by LAPSS to actually log in or perform sensitive actions themselves. The MFA worked as designed. What LAPSS likely did during that brief window of access to the CITL workstation was use OS-level hacking tools, maybe something like Mimikatz, to try and scrape any credentials stored locally on that machine.
Got it. So the lesson isn't Okta was fully breached, but more about vendor risk and the power of MFA.
Precisely. It powerfully highlights supply chain and third-party vendor risk. That's Domain 3, security architecture and engineering, managing outsourced security. Your security posture is only as strong as your partners. But it also unequivocally demonstrates the power and necessity of MFA. It was the control that prevented a limited compromise from becoming much, much worse. And it's a reminder that endpoint security on those contractor machines really matters too.
So what does this tell us about protecting ourselves from this kind of indirect compromise?
Well, mitigations definitely include limiting remote administrative access wherever possible, maybe using secure jump hosts for contractors, absolutely requiring MFA on RDP connections, not just web logins, closely monitoring those third-party sessions for any anomalous activity, and proactively hunting for unexpected credential usage or suspicious processes running on endpoints, especially those with privileged access.
Makes sense. And we can't talk about the human element without mentioning just plain old phishing attacks. They're still rampant, right?
Oh, absolutely. Still probably the #1 initial access vector for many, many attacks, including a lot of ransomware campaigns. They often start with a well-crafted spear phishing email.
Right. Tricking someone into clicking a link or opening an attachment that drops a remote access Trojan
Yeah.
or steals credentials directly via a fake login page.
Exactly. And this ties straight back to your foundational security programs. Domain 5, identity and access management things like robust user awareness training, regular phishing simulations to keep people sharp, effective email security filters to block malicious messages before they even reach the inbox.
If one slips through.
Then it falls to security operations, domain 7. Having the logging, the monitoring, the behavioral analytics in place to detect the anomaly when that RA calls home, or when credentials suddenly get used from an unusual location, catching it early.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Supply chain, 0 days, MFT breaches, ransomware, social engineering. After digging into all these different incidents, what really stands out is that despite the variety of targets and the increasing sophistication, the attacker tactics often repeat. There are common threads, common patterns here.
You're absolutely right, and that's actually good news in a way. Because if the tactics repeat, we can build defenses against those common patterns. We can synthesize these recurring TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. And what's really helpful for security professionals is seeing how a structured framework, like the CISSP domains, provides clear guardrails against these common patterns. It gives you a roadmap for building that robust security posture rather than just reacting to the latest attack.
Okay, let's try and pull those common TTPs together. Thinking about initial access, getting that first foothold, what are the consistent methods we've seen?
Across the board, it's those supply chain backdoors like SolarWinds. It's exploiting unpatched 0 days like ProxyLogon or Log4Shell. It's using stolen credentials, often without MFA, like Colonial Pipeline. And it's classic phishing leading to malware or credential theft. Those are the main doors in. That's MITRETA001.
Right. And once they're inside, what about execution? Running their malicious code.
We consistently see them dropping web shells, especially on web servers, ASPX, PHP shells, using simple, often obfuscated one-line PowerShell commands to download or run things in memory, and setting up scheduled tasks for persistence or delayed execution. That's TA00002 territory.
And speaking of persistence, how do they make sure they can stay in or come back later?
Creating new administrative accounts is a big one. Backdooring legitimate services like we saw with Kaseya replacing Defender, or just simple scheduled task entries that run their malware periodically. Techniques like T5547, boot or logon auto start execution.
Okay, what about privilege escalation? Getting more power once they're in.
Exploiting local vulnerabilities, maybe kernel bugs or those deserialization flaws again, to jump from a regular user to system or root. And critically, dumping credentials from memory. LSAS dumping using tools like Mimikatz is still incredibly common and effective for grabbing higher privilege accounts. T1055, process injection, often plays a role here too.
And defense evasion. They need to hide from security tools.
Oh yeah, this is huge. Abusing code signing with stolen certificates like SolarWinds, actively trying to disable or tamper with antivirus or EDR solutions like Kaseya did with Defender, using steganography sometimes, hiding data in images, and lots of living off the land using built-in Windows tools like PowerShell, Searchidle, WMI, PSExec, things that look normal to avoid triggering alerts.
Got it. Credential access seems related to PrivEsc.
It is. Mimikatz, or directly dumping the LSAS process memory, is the primary way once they have admin rights, but also things like credential stuffing against other services using passwords leaked from elsewhere.
Then they need to understand the network and spread, right? Discovery and lateral movement.
Exactly. They run commands to enumerate the domain, find domain controllers, identify valuable servers or file shares. Then they use tools like PSExec, RDP, SMB Windows, admin shares, maybe exploit vulnerabilities like Eternal Blue if systems aren't patched to move from machine to machine.
And finally, the end game. Exfiltration and get or impact.
Right. They'll often compress stolen data into archives, maybe using legitimate tools like 7-zip again to avoid suspicion. They'll use various methods for exfiltration, maybe hiding it in DNS traffic, uploading to cloud storage, or just direct transfer over their C2 channel.
Yeah.
And then the impact phase, deploying ransomware network-wide, wiping data, or leaking the stolen data publicly for extortion.
Okay, that's a good summary of the common attacker playbook. So facing all that, how does thinking in terms of the CISSP framework, those domains, help us build effective defenses?
Well, it provides that structure. First, defense in depth. It's not just a buzzword. Every single case reinforces it. No single control works all the time. Colonial Pipeline is the perfect example. MFA plus network segmentation could have potentially prevented the pipeline shutdown, even if the initial credential was compromised. Layering is key.
Right. What else?
Incident response, domain 7. It has to be battle-hardened and practiced.
Yeah.
Every case we discussed triggered a major IR effort: emergency patching, frantic log analysis, containment, eradication, recovery, sometimes legal action like the FBI clawing back ransom. You need that playbook ready before the fire starts.
Makes sense.
And risk management, domain 1. It forces you to think about what your critical assets are, inventorying them, understanding their value, and securing them appropriately. Those unpatched internet-facing file transfer servers or critical infrastructure control systems, those carry immense risk and need focused attention and resources. You can't protect everything equally. You have to prioritize based on risk.
Okay, let's try a quick reference. Match the big attack types to the core mitigation strategy. Supply chain attacks, like Trojan updates.
Strict code reviews if you develop software. For consumers, demand transparency from vendors about their secure development practices. Secure your signing keys religiously. And always verify update hashes and signatures before deployment. Trust but verify.
Unpatched CVEs leading to RCE, especially via web apps.
Automated rapid patching is crucial. Vulnerability management. Deploying web application firewalls, WAFs, and intrusion detection prevention systems, IDPS, to catch exploit attempts. And architecturally, limiting the public exposure of applications where possible. Reduce the attack surface.
Ransomware.
MFA everywhere, especially remote access and privileged accounts. Robust, frequent, tested, offline, or immutable backups. Network segmentation to contain the blast radius. And a well-rehearsed incident response plan specifically for ransomware scenarios.
Web shells, those backdoors attackers leave.
Monitor web server directories for unexpected file changes. Use file integrity monitoring, FIM solutions. Actively hunt for suspicious files, search logs, and endpoints for names like human2.ispx or common shell indicators. Set up alerts for unusual processes spawned by your web server.
And that tricky defender evasion, or AVDR evasion in general.
Adopt and assume breach mindset. Rely more on advanced endpoint detection and response, EDR, that looks at behavior, not just signatures. Enforce least privilege, aggressively remove local admin rights from standard users. Use anomaly detection in logs and network traffic to spot things that just look weird, even if they use legitimate tools.
So after all this, it really does seem to boil down to that fundamental principle, doesn't it? The one we keep hearing in security.
Absolutely. It all comes back to that core CISSP maxim. Trust but verify. Whether you're trusting a software update from a major vendor, a connection from a third-party contractor, a user logging in via VPN, or even your own internal systems talking to each other, you need controls, you need verification, you need layers. Trust has to be earned and continuously validated at every single step. Yeah.
And studying these real-world breaches, digging into the TTPs, seeing how defenses failed or succeeded, that's how security professionals really learn. It helps you harden your architecture, domains 3 and 4, enforce robust identities, domain 5, tune your security operations, domain 7, and refine those incident responder playbooks. It's about learning from the past to build a more resilient future.
That was an incredible deep dive. We've definitely seen the sophistication, the evolution of these attacks, but also, thankfully, the consistency in the underlying tactics and the fundamental importance of layered defenses and constant vigilance.
Absolutely. So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Given how quickly attackers adapt, how they reuse these tactics across different targets, what's one area, just one area in your own digital life, or maybe in your organization, that you previously thought was kind of set and forget, safe enough, but now, after hearing all this, you realize maybe it needs a fresh look, a second look through that lens of trust but verify? That is a powerful question to leave folks with. Really makes you think. We definitely encourage you to continue your own deep dive into these concepts. Keep learning, keep verifying, stay safe out there.
Stay safe.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.